My Place in Canadian History by Jamie Monroe. My story begins in 1881 when John Ready, my great-great-great-grandfather, first arrived in Brandon, Manitoba from Ireland. Since the 17th century, the Irish immigration rate to Canada has been excessively high. The Irish people were a huge contributor to Canada's population growth and a huge part of the development of Canadian society. Back in Ireland, with the extremely cold temperatures all year round, many struggled with growing crops and found themselves beginning to fall into poverty, prompting them to immigrate to Canada in hopes of a better future. The majority of the Irish during this time settled in Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. However, my great-great-great-grandfather migrated to the western countryside region into the prairie provinces. He decided to come to Canada because of the rich soil Manitoba had to offer, which was ideal for farming, and saw it as an excellent sense of hope for himself. He did not consider settling in any other country besides Canada because Canada was a young, newly developed country that offered the liberty and opportunity he needed. However, his first arrival brought many struggles. He had little money or farming materials. Luckily, with the little money he had, he was able to claim file on a homestead in Reston. Even so, he decided he would spend the winter in Brandon to find employment in order to earn more money. In the spring of 1882, he returned to his homestead after purchasing some implements and supplies to develop his farm. It was at that time he married Bella Boyle, and together they had 5 sons, John Jr., James, Harold, Welland, and Ernest, and 1 daughter, Mary. You may wonder what caused this small family of 9 to become this big. And what important historical events that occurred in the past influenced my existence today. Well, the first huge historical event took place in 1914 when the First World War began. My great-great-great-uncle, John Jr., and my great-great-grandfather, Welland, enlisted in the war to fight overseas in 1916. Unfortunately, John Jr. was killed in action just 12 days before the war ended. Because John Jr. only had 1 daughter and no sons to carry on the Ready name, that branch of the family sadly died. Luckily for Welland, he survived and in 1919 got to return home to his wife, Bijou, his 3 daughters, Roberta, Louise, and Jean, and his 3 sons, Mac, Kenneth, and Douglas. Thankfully, his family branch was able to continue onward. Years passed, and life was looking up when the Roaring '20s hit. The 1920s brought lots of money and several luxuries for my family, and insisted in easing their miseries from the brutal war. The mass production provided my family with a spankin' new automobile, and radio, which was found to be very useful. Being farmers was an isolated life to live, and so these new inventions kept my family in touch with those in urban areas, as well as making travel more convenient. The mass production also brought combine onto their farm, which made work a lot easier and less time-consuming. Sadly, when the stock market crashed in 1929 and the Great Depression began, my family's successes from the decade before had vanished. For one of Wayland's daughters, Roberta, my great-grandmother, she experienced the Depression on her farm with her husband, Bill McDonald. During the dirty 30s, they had little money. They struggled due to the drought that occurred on many nearby farms. The drought dried out a large amount, if not all, of their crops. However, despite their struggles, my great-grandparents were able to remain positive and hopeful. Their suffering stopped in 1939 when the Great Depression finally ended, and the Second World War started. My great-grandfather joined the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. He did not actually fight in combat warfare, but was involved with the technical duties since he had an IQ of over 150. He was stationed in northwestern Europe and remained there until the end of the Second World War, when he returned home to Canada. Throughout those 6 years, his wife, 3 daughters, Maureen, Jacqueline, and Bonnie, and 1 son, Bill Jr., contributed towards the war tremendously. They would knit clothing, send food from their farm, and donate as much money as they could for the soldiers. Bonnie, their eldest child, my grandmother, was only 2 years old when her father left for war. She barely knew him. Even after the war, he usually kept quiet and distanced himself from his family. The experiences of the war unable to erase themselves from his memory. A year later, things began to brighten up when the McDonalds moved to Montreal after my great-grandfather was offered a job as head personnel with Air Canada. Although Montreal took some adjusting to because of the French culture, it was where my Nana met my grandpa, Laurie Hart. In 1955, they got married, and together had 1 son, Mike, and 3 daughters, Mary, Jody, and Kelly. Mary, the oldest daughter, is my mother. She wanted to pursue the family business that my great-grandfather had started, and decided to be a stewardess for Air Canada. In 1988 was when my mom met my dad, Ken Monroe, on a blind date that was set up by a good friend of theirs. Sparks flew, and their blind date turned into something more serious. They married in 1990 and moved into a big house in Markham. Together they had 2 sons, Keegan and Tyler, and 1 daughter, me. All in all, my family withstood some catastrophic occurrences: the Great Depression and 2 world wars. However, regardless of the misfortunes, if it were not for the courageous efforts and hard work, I would not be here today. Our family started in Canada because of my great-great-great-grandfather and his quest for success. We have gone through generations and been growing over the past decades, all the way from starting with my great-great-great-grandparents and working its way down until you reach my cousins, brothers, and I at the very bottom. I, being one of the children, the generation of today, will assist in continuing the growth of my family tree. I intend to write my own future and do something great with it, by contributing to Canada like my ancestors did, by being a doctor, a teacher, or maybe even a flight attendant. A flight attendant for Air Canada, of course. But whatever I choose, I will be making my mark in this world, and my place in Canadian history.